Buenos dias. Good morning. Thank you for battling the torrential rain out there and making your way to the Wilson Center. I want to welcome you to the Wilson Center. My name is Eric Olson. I'm the Deputy Director of the Latin American program here. We're delighted to have all of you with us today. We have people online, tens of millions of people on the international internet, worldwide net. So always delighted to have them here. And it's one reason we always ask you to speak into the mic when you ask questions at the end, so we have a faithful recording and that people online can hear from us. We are excited today to welcome our friends from the International Organization of Migration to talk about returning home, the challenges and opportunities faced by returned migrants to the Northern Triangle of Central America. This is another installment in our series on Central America and Mexico and the factors contributing to migration. We've looked a lot at the violence and the inequality and lack of public safety for people as one of those driving factors. But as you know, a lot has been said about changing U.S. policy on migration enforcement, both on the border and within our country, changing policies on detention, prosecution, and removal. The question is whether deportations will begin to soar or will they remain basically where they are now. What is clear is that arrivals are way down. We had a meeting a little over a week ago with Secretary Kelly, and he said the numbers were as much as 75% down on new apprehensions at the southwest border, primarily Central American family units and so on. Today, however, we're taking a particular look at returnees and the implications for that group of people and their towns, their communities, and their countries as a whole. We will shed some light on the perennial question of what happens when people are returned to their countries of origin, especially when those places are experiencing high levels of violence, social instability, and dramatic economic hardship. Deportation, removal, or return of migrants is not the end of the story for the individual migrant, and it should not be viewed as the end of the story for the countries during the returning, the returners, if you will, and whether or not those returners are Mexico, the country of Mexico, or the United States. We're pleased today to have with us representatives from the International Organization of Migration. IOM works, according to their website, works to help ensure the orderly and humane management of migration, to promote international cooperation on migration issues, to assist in the search for practical solutions to migrants' problems, and to provide humanitarian assistance to migrants in need, including refugees and internally displaced people. What is important, I think, to point out about IOM, and I'll ask Jorge to correct me, is that it's really not, it provides services, it works with migrants, but it's not a protection agency per se, right? You don't have a protection function. That would be the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So that's an important distinguishing factor. We're delighted to be joined today by our friends from IOM, and I will introduce first Jorge Pedasi, who will make some opening comments, and then we'll hear from our panelists. We will also, hopefully, be joined soon by Doris Meisner, who will be a commentator on their presentation. I'll introduce Doris when she arrives, but we hope she makes it. So let me introduce Jorge. Jorge Pedasi is the Chief of Mission for the Northern Triangle of Central America at the International Organization for Migration. He previously held the position of Regional Officer for Project Development at IOM's South American office, which included responsibility for IOM's operations in Brazil. Until October 2011, he served as coordinator of the Technical Secretariat for Regional Conference on Migration, RCM, sometimes referred to as the Puebla Process. Prior to RCM, he worked for more than 6 years with IOM as program specialist at the Liaison Unit for Migration Management Services in the Office for Central America and Mexico. We are delighted to have him here. He will make some opening remarks, and then I will introduce our other speakers. Thank you. Adelante.
Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Good morning, everybody. Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody who has supported IOM to be this morning today. Eric, thanks to, I want to thank the Wilson Center, you, for opening the doors to IOM and allowing us to present this morning some of the work we have been doing in the last years in the Northern Triangle countries, or at least part of the work we have been doing there. As you might recall, in 2014, the second half of 2014, everybody was just speaking about the crisis in relation to the unaccompanied migrant children. And in each of the countries, there were different types of responses. Task forces were created, most of them led by the government institutions, in order to give solutions to, or at least find some sort of solutions to what was happening at that moment. Some of the alternatives were developing prevention campaigns of irregular migration, but the main challenge at that moment was to find, to provide services to the people who were being returned, not only the children, but in general, all migrants. In that sense, the IOM started to cooperate closely with the institutions that were in charge of providing precisely those services to the migrants who were being returned. You might realize that people were coming with high levels of anxiety, sometimes with health problems, sometimes in need of legal assistance, and several requirements that once you're back in your home country, you need in order to start the process of reintegration and return. And in that sense, in 2014, 2015, IOM supported the governments to strengthen their capacities in providing those kind of services. 2015, we saw that the numbers were not decreasing, and in fact, we saw a slight increment in the number of unaccompanied migrant children who were participating in the migration flows. 2016, figures dropped a little bit, total figures, but not those related to the children who were participating in the migration flows. And as Eric already has mentioned, 2017, we have a different scenario. So since then, apart from responding to the immediate needs of the people who were being returned, and also, for example, in terms of humanitarian assistance and so on, and maybe I'm going to correct here Eric, because yes, IOM does some sort of protection, particularly of vulnerable migrants, where the line that divides us is the fact if they are refugees or are seeking for asylum. But IOM does have some programs to protect, for example, victims of trafficking and so on. So we did extensive work to support migrants that were in vulnerable conditions when they arrived back to their countries. And the good thing is that that work through the last 2 years has helped us to develop some strategies together with the governments, the involved governments, in terms of a midterm reintegration process. is one of the main challenges right now. There are good, very good experiences going right now, ongoing in the different countries. But if we really want to achieve a sort of sustainable return, durable solutions are required. Of course, as you will see and as my colleagues will present, it all depends on the reasons why people have migrated. And of course, in that sense, differentiated responses need to be put in place. But this is just some introduction remarks. I'm going to ask my colleagues to elaborate more on what we want to present today. David will refer to data we have been gathering for the last months using some specific methods that IOM has developed worldwide and is implementing worldwide, like the DTM, Displacement Tracking Matrix, and special surveys. But we also present some data, official data from government institutions. And then Natalia will also help us to reflect a little bit on the situation of people behind the numbers. We always claim, and that has been very good, that the leaders of the three governments involved always say that we should not only concentrate on figures, but we should have and consider the human aspect and the realities of all these people. So both my colleagues will reflect on that, and in the end I will add some other remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. Let me just quickly say a special word of welcome to a couple of distinguished visitors. Ambassador Canjura has come from the Embassy of El Salvador. We're always welcome here, and good to see you, Ambassador. Thank you. And of course, Ambassador Francisco Campbell from Nicaragua. I think he's now the Dean of Central American Ambassadors. I don't know if that's good or bad, but you've been here as long as anybody, and we're always delighted to have you here. Thank you, Ambassador, as well. Let me introduce other panelists this morning quickly. We have full bios in the back if you want to know more, but I'll just highlight briefly some of their background. And that reminds me of another thing. Anders told me that they might have run out of some of the material in the back. That will all be posted online with the video from this webcast, so you will have access to that, plus the presentations from our speakers, so please avail yourself of that. Okay, we're going to hear first from David Morales, who has been IOM's Information Management and Research Officer for the Northern Triangle since 2014, and currently oversees the Northern Triangle Migration Management Initiative in the region. Mr. Morales also co-leads the Displacement Tracking Matrix team in the Northern Triangle and regularly travels to other regions to support IOM's global operations. After David speaks, we'll hear from Natalia Cepeda. She has been with IOM since 2014. A lot of people started in 2014. I wonder why. Crisis time. 2014 as the National Project Coordinator in El Salvador, and has experience coordinating and managing two migrant programs. One, the Post-Arrival Assistance Program from 2014 to 2016, and another, Return and Reintegration in El Salvador. Ms. Cepeda has also worked as Chief of Knowledge Management in the Solidarity Fund for Health in El Salvador from 2012 to 2014. And we are, of course, delighted to welcome back to the Wilson Center our friend Doris Meisner. She regularly comes and adds a great bit of depth and knowledge to our discussions about migration and refugees and the movement of people, and so we're always delighted to have you here. Doris is the former commissioner of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS, and at present is a senior fellow at the Migration Policy Institute, where she directs the Institute's U.S. migration policy work. Her responsibilities focus in particular on the role of migration in America's future and on administering the nation's immigration laws, systems, and government agencies. And we're always delighted to collaborate and work with MPI, and I suspect that may even increase. since our former Executive Vice President, Andrew Seeley, will be the new president of MPI in the coming months. So we are always delighted to work with you. Thank you, Doris, for being with us. All right, so let's get into it here. David, would you lead us off? I'm going to move back just a little bit so my bald head doesn't get in the way.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really honored to be presenting here in front of so many people who are interested in working hard on the same topics as we do. As Eric said, we will be presenting data on 3 levels. Number 1, official government data on returning migrants. Number 2, a particular survey that we did on unaccompanied migrant children, but returning to their home countries. And number 3, a little bit of information on DTM, Displacement Tracking Matrix, an IOM global tool to try to give key insights into the topic of internal displacement, whether it's caused by natural disasters, climate change, or violence and insecurity. To begin with, as you might have heard in the news, most of the information that we get in the news is from apprehensions and profiles from apprehended migrants. But today we would like to provide you a different point of view, a point of view from the countries of origin, particularly from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. According to the different institutions of migrations in the region, from the period January to April, we have over 45,000 people returning to the Northern Triangle. And here there is one key definition. We consider a returning migrant. We include only irregular migration. We're talking about people who migrated or attempted to migrate in an irregular fashion and were returned to their home countries, both from the US and from Mexico. So this number represents both countries, United States and Mexico, for the Northern Triangle. We can see there is a decrease for the same period compared to the same period last year of about 28%, and it's driven mostly by a decrease in returns from Mexico.
Excuse me, does it include deportees and voluntary returns?
Well, it includes, yes, most of the data from irregular migration that is being registered by the governments. It is from some countries, because we're also including, you'll see a small percentages from other countries like Norway and Italy.
Yeah, but I mean, is it deportation?
Yes.
Everything? Everybody who returns either that deported or voluntarily?
It's, depending on the country, there is a different legal figure for the administrative operation. In the US, yes, it's deportations. In Mexico, it's called returns. It's a different name, but it's the same principle. Then we have disaggregated data. The joint work along with the governments in the Northern Triangle has enabled disaggregate data on, age, sex, breakdown, and so on for all the returning migrants in the 3 countries. And you can see there is a change. The largest change is in Guatemala. You can see the total figures in 2017 and the variation in each country. It's important to note that Guatemala also has the largest population, 18 million people, 16 million people. Honduras has 8 million people, around 8 million people, and El Salvador is 6.5, depending on the estimations. So you can see that the numbers follow the population in the same order in each country. Well, something that happened this year, differently from the past 2 years, is that for the first time the US is now the majority of the repatriate. Most of the returnees are coming from the US now, 52%, and 47.8% from Mexico. Traditionally, Mexico has been 60% or a little bit more. So it's a change that we're seeing now. Largest decrease has been in returning migrants from Mexico, and returning migrants from the US has increased in 20%. As for age groups, we have adults, and you see that most of the returning migrants are male, 83%, compared to women, who are 16.6%. And the percentages are a little bit more balanced in the children group. This is because, as you might know, families are also migrating. And when an unaccompanied migrant child would migrate or attempt to migrate, there is a higher risk, of course. So it's more of a male migration. But in families, they go with their parents, so it doesn't make a difference. So that's why the percentages are a little bit more balanced. Well, in this graph, you can see the monthly flows, northern triangle, from January to December. Gray color is 15 calendar year, January, December. Blue is 16, and orange is 17. You can see that the trend has changed. The returning migrants, has seen a general reduction in numbers, completely opposite to what would be expected in the month of April. And as I said, it's driven mostly by a big reduction in returning migrants from Mexico. In here, as I know that everybody asks the reasons why this has happened, or our perspective from what has happened, there are several different possible causes. It's still a very small sample, as you can see, it's just 4 months. But basically, there is some anecdotal reports on new routes being used by smugglers, of course, particularly in the Pacific, from Guatemala to after Acapulco in the state of Guerrero, instead of using the traditional route, which is, as we know, the train called La Bestia, and everything that is in the papers. Also, of course, is basically it's uncertainty. The migrant persons or their families are in a uncertainty situation, and they might be also postponing decisions, of course. Now, if you see the structural factors, both push and pull factors, meaning poverty, violence, unemployment, and pull factors such as the Latino unemployment rate in the US, for example, you see no big changes. Moreover, it's, you see that the unemployment rate in the US is relatively low and has kept at that level. So we cannot say that this is a structural change or a permanent change. And then now we would like to, this was all government official information. You can find it in the websites in Conmigo Observatorio in Honduras, or in Dirección General de Migración en Guatemala, and the Dirección General de Migración y Extranjería en El Salvador. And this part now, we will present a basic household survey on the families of unaccompanied migrant children returning to their home countries. In this case, we did not interview any migrant person because, as you might know, during the returning process, there are several interviews performed by child protection institutions from the governments, directorates of migration. We have also ministries of health, and all of these institutions involved in the returning process. So in order to avoid re-victimization, as we say, we interviewed their legal guardians or parents waiting for them at reception centers. In that way also, because they're children, you get to have more information on the household and the conditions in which they live and in which they'll return to live in. And not only from the child, but also from the whole environment. Well, much has been said about, of course, unaccompanied migrant children. So I'm just going to show some basic data. Most of the returning migrants are boys, and the average age is 15 to 16 years old. And there is about 30% who are girls. The average age is 1 year younger. As for indicators for years of schooling or education, well, you can see that most of them did not meet the criteria for reaching an acceptable level for their age, particularly for the population between 16 to 18 years old. when we asked the families what were the motivations to migrate, well, most people in the 3 countries will try to give only one answer, but we understand, and it's one of the most important findings, that migration is multi-causal. You cannot attribute it to a single cause. It's not depending on agencies or governments or so on. Responses can vary, but in reality, of course, the family, the person, takes a lot of conditions or variables into account. Not only the fact of family reunification, but also better opportunities, employment. Yes, children have employment as a motivation to migrate as well, particularly from 15 to 18 years old. And violence and security, of course. In Guatemala, we have more natural disasters as a motivation, and climate change, not meaning that, of course, the people were asked if they thought that climate change was a motivation to migrate, but how the lack of job opportunities in the countryside, in the rural areas from coffee plantations, for example, had dropped as a result of the recent drought that you see in the papers in the past 3 years. On the right side, there's a Venn diagram in which we try to graph the interaction between variables. So you can see the most common interaction is family reunification with standards of living and employment, followed by violence and insecurity and family reunification. But definitely you cannot attribute this to a single cause. This is a very important thing. The decision is complex, and you have to take into account all the environment of the family. As for family reunification, since you see here that 21.9, 22%, and you might think this is a little bit low, we also ask whether they had relatives abroad. And the fact is that there are some important variations in between countries, but 71% of the families or the household had a relative living abroad, and the majority of them were sending remittances. So it's a very important factor because family reunification sometimes is treated as including all types of family reunification, whether it's a father, mother, or an uncle, aunt, and so on. But it includes the extended family as well. And as for violence and insecurity, we had some statistics on the types of violence or insecurity reported in the 3 countries. Most of them are threats or harassments to the child. But there is also prevention, murder, attempt, extortion, robbery, theft. A very important aspect of this survey is that we not only take into consideration whether something happened to the child, but also to the extended family. Because as you might know, if, to put an extreme example, your neighbor was murdered, you're not going to wait till something happens to your family to make a decision. So this is what we call prevention as well. It means nothing directly to the household, but it definitely served as a motivation to migrate. The household size is relatively large. It's about 6 people per household, including the migrant child. We have about 2 adults and 1 migrant child, sorry. And heads of households. There are important differences that we try to separate here. In El Salvador, 72% of heads of households were female, whereas in Guatemala it's the opposite, 70% were male. Something very important is that 70% of all unaccompanied migrant children returning to Guatemala belong to an ethnic indigenous group, such as the Maya and all the linguistics and the 24 groups that are currently in the lists, of course. And this is related to culture. Who is considered the head of the household? It's not who makes the most money. It's not. It's basically the person who makes the decisions. And for this methodology, you have to take into account that the person has to be living in the house. Because most people will say, the person abroad is still the head of the household, but the reality is that who's making the decisions and taking care of the household is another person. So this is a very important methodological aspect. Another thing and a limitation, as you might imagine, is that since we're asking heads of household for this information, there is one motivation to migrate that will not come out or show up in this data, which is domestic violence. This is not the type of instrument to try to measure that as a cause. That would be an official and proper interview by child protection institutions in each country. We don't recommend going and interviewing children for the sake of a document, right? It should be like done with a proper protocol. Years of schooling is very important as well. You can see that there's a large difference in Guatemala. Most heads of household of this, of the families where the migrant child lives have about 3 years of schooling, meaning that they reached 3rd grade. And this is related to opportunities for the families, of course. The composition, there are large differences in between countries, but on average, you have that 25% of all these families are single-parent households. And you have 4.3% who live with their grandparents. This is filtering all the possible combinations, meaning that it's just the grandfather or grandmother, nobody in between, no father, no mother, and then there is the child. So we're talking about children who used to live with their grandparents, and now they're going back to live just with their grandparents. 10% live with their aunts or uncles, and 45% were biparental. But this doesn't mean that there's a biological father and mother. It means that there is a family of 2 parents or responsible legal guardians. So you can have families where the father lives abroad or mother lives abroad, and then back in the home country, they have restructured the family and have remarried or re-engaged to other people. However, this is the legal guardian or the parent does not have to be biological, of course, right? So in El Salvador, this percentage of biparental households, meaning both parents, it's about 30%. It's a lot lower than the rest of the countries compared to Guatemala and Honduras. And you can see a lot of insights into this, previous migration, but also family disintegration. It's a big problem that constantly appears in our data. Then we also asked about, most of the information is about the migrant children, but we also asked about the non-migrant children within the same households. And on average, they're younger. They're 5 years younger than their brothers or sisters. And you can see that there's more balance in the sex and age breakdown. This is because, of course, what we talked about before. This is the normal, regular demographic composition, almost 50-50, instead of what we see in returning migrants. Why more boys than girls? Well, because most boys will travel without not most, but a larger portion of the children who are boys will travel without the company of a coyote, smuggler, trafficker, etc., whereas girls mostly with the services of a smuggler. And for families, well, it changes, of course. And also, women and girls have somehow a little bit more access to protection services sometimes, of course. As for schooling years, we see the same indicators, not reaching the expected years of schooling for both groups, both from 12 to 15 to 16 and 18. Most of unaccompanied migrant children returning to the 3 countries are 15 years old. Of course, we see very few, there are cases, but we see very few children below 5 and 6 years old. Of the non-migrant children, 28% were currently not attending school. This was done, of course, during school year, and it's for ages from 7 to 18. You can see the main reasons that came out in the survey. There's important differences between countries. High cost of education is higher in Guatemala. You see that we have weighted the averages according to the population of each country, of returning migrant children in each country. So Guatemalan averages will have a higher weight than Salvadorian or Hondurans. Insecurity is a little bit higher in El Salvador, and then we have others, which is domestic violence, sexual harassment, family disintegration, illness, work, and so on. The type of floor in the house, according to the head of household, well, it's basically for the Northern Triangle, 32% of all these households had dirt floors, meaning that they don't have the basic conditions that you would expect from a regular house. And this percentage is a lot higher, of course, in the case of rural households. You can see 44%. Differences in between countries you can see in this little table. You can see that the highest one is in Guatemala. Migration in Honduras, contrary to what some people might expect, it's compared to the other countries, more urban. And you can see that reflected in the indicators here. And as for urban households, you can see that 17% or 18% reporting having dirt floors. If you consider the sex of the head of the household or the gender of the head of the household, you can see that on average, if you're a male, you're more likely to have dirt floors than if you're female. And this could be related, well, there's many explanations, but also to the management of resources, of course, and the decisions that we make, but also to if the female has a relative abroad, for example, the ex-husband, ex-partner, and he's probably sending support for the children. Access to services, we see that averages are particularly similar in the three countries. We publish these indicators basically on national reports, so we get to compare them with official a national level household survey from the National Institute of Statistics data. And we see very similar data in this cases, very similar to the general population. As for we build vulnerability indexes, and this is one of them. Basically, we also build them by the composition of the household. And two key findings here are, well, it's not here right now, but if you see the publications that we have, if the child lives with the grandparents or aunts or uncles, it's more likely to have better conditions in the house than if he lives with both parents. Yeah, so you can, drinking water, dirt floor, and ownership of the property. You can see that the worst indicators related to poverty are in Guatemala, of course. And then you have Honduras for some, and then El Salvador. Honduras is usually in the other indicators in between El Salvador and Guatemala. And, this is a basic overall view of the data on unaccompanied migrant children returning to the Northern Triangle. And next, and to close, we would like to present the DTM. DTM is a global methodology. We adapted it a little bit in the context of the Northern Triangle because differently to other regions, you don't see massive flows of people moving from one part of the country to the other. It's very much in the same municipality and spread out. So it makes very difficult, if you're not familiarized with DTM, it's a tool that allows to track and be able to provide quick, relevant information on the flows of people moving from one place to another. Since it's impossible in these cases to really count all of the people and to try to do a profiling in this sense, we developed priority index based on 3 basic levels. We tackled 3 topics. One is migration. The second one is foreign migrants in transit. And the third one is displacement. And here are some relevant, because we focus on migration mostly, I'm going to present here the information about migrants, foreign migrants in transit. We have, in this methodology, we ask key informants, whether it's service providers on, from nonprofit organizations, municipal governments, and other key actors. We asked them if they had received humanitarian support requests from people from other countries transiting or traveling through the region. And this is what we see in the data. It's basically percentage of municipalities out of the total. So you can see for countries like Guatemala and Honduras, the highest percentage you see is Salvadorans and Hondurans. And you can see also for El Salvador, you can see lots of people from Nicaragua passing through. It's one of the ways that we have in trying to produce information about something that is not really researched about. And there's a lot of, particularly in Guatemala, you see lots of migrants from Congo, Haiti, Venezuela, and so on. And this trend has been increasing in the past years. Now, as for displacement, this shows data for persons or families who have had to move from their current place of residence, habitual place of residence, to other places due to natural disasters, violence, insecurity, and effects attributed to climate change. And we broke them down into groups. Expulsion and reception. Expulsion meaning people who requested help to the municipality or nonprofit organizations or local organizations because they were being forced to move to other places. And reception is people coming from other municipalities to the municipality of analysis, meaning they were coming from the municipality next to them, coming to this one and requesting to be helped to be able to move there. What kind of services do they provide? Well, basically aluminum rooftops and wood to build houses, which also creates different problems. Of course, as you can imagine, unplanned urban development can be really troublesome, of course. We have the percentages of municipalities. We have that in El Salvador, 61% of the municipalities reported receiving at least one request. This is not 60% of the country. This is not 60% of the municipality. This is just 60% of all the municipalities reported receiving at least one case. So it's very important to make that distinction. In Guatemala, it was about 30%, and in Honduras, it was about 32%. As for reception, we can see the numbers are relatively similar. So it's like a zero-sum game. Because people living from some places are sometimes going to, it will show up in the places in reception in the other municipality, of course. And you can see the maps. The map here is for El Salvador. The darker the red color is, meaning more expulsion, and the larger the green bubble or circle means a greater reception. And two things come to mind. First, there's no direct relation between green and red, because there are some really red places that have large green bubbles, meaning that the phenomenon or the issue is stays in the same municipality. Municipalities are large enough or big enough for people to move within to different neighborhoods that are relatively safe or are not in direct risk of suffering from earthquakes or flooding and other aspects. And the second thing is that this is somehow related to some official data of murder rate as well. So you have the eastern part, north part, and a little bit of San Salvador, of course. You can see number 5 or 10, and La Libertad in 5. And we see the same in Guatemala. You can see in here, and Petén, of course, and the part closest to Honduras and the Caribbean. And you can see Honduras, the Caribbean, of course, here. And here as well. It's important because as you saw in the motivations, in the case, although it's in the case of unaccompanied migrant children, violence plays a role. It's not all of them, but it plays a very important role. And this could be related to internal displacement as well as a mechanism to seek for protection. Of course, we have also family reunification, we have opportunities, you know, but this is also a very important topic. And that's the end of the data part of the presentation. We have breakdowns by municipality on totals, you see. But if you divide it by the population in each municipality, you see that the map changes like a rate of return or migration somehow. This is more traditional with what we're used to. Historically, migration-related communities in the north and in the east. But in totals, you can see urban centers. And we work closely with governments to produce relevant information for all agencies and institutions involved. So thank you very much.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Let's talk today about migration, specifically the return and the reintegration in the Northern Triangle countries and what's been happening between 2014 until now. But first of all, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to tell you a story, so pay a little bit of more attention. This is Jose. Jose, unfortunately, I cannot show you his face in order to protect his identity. Jose is only 15 years old. And let's imagine Jose's life. Jose lives in a community far away from the main city in El Salvador. This is San Salvador. And to be able to access to his home community, Jose has to walk every day more than 2 hours from the main road. His house is made of metal roof and metal walls, and its floor is from dirt. He doesn't have access to potable water, neither to electricity. And Jose lives in the same bedroom with his mother and his other 2 brothers. And he sleeps even in the same bed with his other 2 brothers. Jose was raised alone by his mother because his father never appeared. So Jose had to work and he quitted school. So these are just some of the circumstances and the conditions on why Jose traveled alone to the north, and he was found in Mexico. And while he was returning to El Salvador, he traveled more than 23 hours all the way from Acayucan in Mexico to San Salvador. And he arrived to a place that he'd never been before. And this place is a reception center. And when he arrived, he had several days without taking a shower, without changing his clothes. He was suffering with stomach aches. And this is how he felt when I interviewed him in the reception center in El Salvador. IOM has always maintained that the effectiveness of a migrant returns depends on appropriate reintegration assistance. This means correct preparation in advance and appropriate supervision by the country of origin. As I can assume that all of you are aware, in 2014, the Northern Triangle countries were already receiving migrant returnees and were already providing assistance. But it was until 2014 that set the point of a change during the post-arrival assistance. At that time, the national governments counted with a few national institutions already providing assistance in these reception centers, but required more support for adequate spaces for receiving migrant returnees, especially children, boys and girls. So in 2014, IOM was allowed to work hand by hand with the countries of origin to strengthen their capacity into receiving migrant returnees. So therefore, from 2014 until now, the 3 countries has been able to assist more than 60,000 people, almost 16,000 people, sorry. And this means providing humanitarian assistance, post-arrival assistance, as we call it, from hygiene kits, food items, non-food items, transportation, telephone calls, clothes items, medical care, and psychological attention. As you can see on the images, we're showing the difference and the comparison between the reception centers on how they were in 2014 and how they are now. And for example, you can see Casa Nuestras Raíces in Guatemala, in Quetzaltenango, and of course also Belén in San Pedro Sula, Honduras. And the last one is where Jose arrived, the Dirección de Atención al Migrante in El Salvador. It's based in the community called La Chacra. And now this reception center remodel has the capacity to receive more than 200 persons at the same time, and now counts with an adequate reception process, allowing specialized attentions for children, for psychological attentions, for medical cares. And this is how it looks. And this now is a model of reception center that has been exchanging experiences with Honduras and Guatemala and other several countries interested in this. Because in El Salvador, there's more than 8 national institutions providing assistance at the same time and coordinating among themselves. And it has a series of steps, order steps, that a person, a migrant returnee, when they arrive to a reception center, can pass through. Like, for example, not only receiving humanitarian assistance and allowing them to contact their family members, passing through the migratory reception process, but also receiving medical care, obligatory for children under 5 years old, and as well as pregnant women. But also, it is important to see that all of these steps has an impact and means a difference for a migrant returnee. Like, for example, Jose. If he hadn't received the last step, a group session of talking about their experiences and an individual psychological interview, he hadn't felt like this after he concluded the reception process. So this is a map, just to show you quickly, the 8 locations where in the Northern Triangle countries have improved their capacities, not only during the reception processes, but also at the shelters. But another fundamental aspect of this is the effectiveness of return in the attention and guidance provided by national staff. And now more than 900 people in the 3 countries have reinforced their capacity to receive and coordinate among themselves the assistance for migrant returnees. And as you can see in this image, this is the coordination among a psychologist working together with the migration interviewer, assistant, and adolescent. But another fundamental aspect also is working in awareness campaigns focused not only on destigmatization of migrant returnees once they arrive back to the countries of origin, but also to provide information to teenagers like Jose about the risks of irregular migration. And of course, one of the fundamental aspects of all of this has been as well information data sharing agreements and management as well, strengthening the national capacities information systems in order to reduce not only the time during the process of reception, but also to reduce re-victimization once migrant returnees arrive. But also having and counting with these statistics and information, as my colleague previously showed you, allows us not only to address specific actions for specific profiles and specific territories in countries of origin, and this is basic information for addressing all of our actions into reintegration. Now we count with data and evidence. So what happens after the reception? IOM understands that reintegration is the reinclusion or reincorporation of a person into a process or a group. This means allowing the migrant returnee to participate in the social, political, and cultural aspects of its country of origin. Therefore, countries of origin are working to strengthen referral processes of attention at the local level. So teenagers like Jose that, for example, received a psychological attention during the process of reception can continue the treatment once they arrive to the community of origin. But also countries of origin, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, are also strengthening the regional exchange of best practices and lessons learned among the reception and reintegration. But now, what are the challenges? Countries of origin still require support to strengthen mechanisms for the protection of migrant returnees all the way to their communities of origin, not only now from reception centers. And this is especially for boys, girls, and families. But also to integrate more services and ensure their attention towards the reincorporation of migrant returnees into society and back at their community level. For example, educational services, employment, health, among other services. But also another important aspect that we still have to be working on is reducing stigmatization of migrant returnees as a perception of the rest of the population that has stayed in the country of origin. But understanding as well that reintegration is a matter of development, and that means that countries of origin have to continue working towards improving the structural causes. And this is something that they cannot do alone, and it cannot be changed from one day to another. And finally, even though much has been changed, there is still a lot to be done, and we cannot do this together. We have to do it all together. So one day, people like Jose can accomplish dreams like this. This is Jose leaving the reception center in El Salvador, La Chacra, and he's heading all the way back to his community of origin with his family. And there is where we must go to now. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. Very interesting. I have a number of questions, but I will resist and ask Doris to offer a few words, insight, and commentary. I'll give Jorge a chance to fill anything we might have missed, and then you all, it's your turn in a little bit. So prepare yourselves for questions. So Doris, thank you.
Okay, Eric, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I really commend IOM on this research, this effort, and you for the hard work that I know this kind of research represents. It's difficult to do this kind of work, and it is, it's emotionally difficult, and it's also methodologically difficult. So this approach that you've taken, looking at and being engaged with people in the return process as compared to the either transit or apprehension process, as you said at the outset, I think is unique. I don't think we've seen this before, you know, with this particular issue. I mean, we've obviously had anecdotal information and fairly sophisticated anecdotal information through some of the work that UNHCR has done in the region and one or two of the NGOs, but I haven't seen anything that's this comprehensive and actually could methodologically, I think, stand up beyond anecdote. So that's a really important contribution, and thank you. I pulled out, I think, 6 points. I've been listening as you go along, in addition to having reviewed it beforehand, and I think I have 6 big areas. Maybe it's one more or less. Just to get the conversation going, I mean, of things that I think this really points to that are so interesting, that raise, deeper questions, and that are somewhat policy related. Because at the end of the day, that's ultimately what I think one wants research like this to be able to speak to. And so let me start with the point that comes out right at the beginning, and that is the reduced numbers of returns. And the reduced numbers of returns are rather different among the countries, which is interesting. And may or may not, but probably would have something to do with the reasons that people are leaving, although we don't really know. I mean, it's interesting that Guatemala is significantly lower than the other 2 countries, and we've always known that the Guatemalan migration is probably somewhat different in character from the migration coming from Honduras and El Salvador. So understanding that those reductions a little better would be important. You've said that you believe that it has to do with differences in Mexican enforcement or Mexican, activity. It may also have to do with what we're experiencing at the southwest border, which is significant reductions in flow overall, and that's now been going on for the latest numbers just came in within the last several days. That trend seems to be continuing, and it is significantly lower than any kind of seasonal analysis would lead you to believe. So, of course, the discussion in this country, as we all know, is this a Trump effect? And if so, what does that really mean? It's an important question because the politics surrounding immigration and migration flows obviously are very top line in this new administration's thinking and work. And, often it is ascribed to the rhetoric that's been used about the southwest border itself, about building a wall. I myself think that it may have more, if there is a Trump effect, it may have more to do with what's going on in the interior of the country and with the change in policy and the change in the treatment of enforcement in the interior of the country, because we know that the information networks are very, very efficient among families and communities and also through the smugglers. So we don't know the answer to that, but we, I think, see in your numbers a reflection from returns of what it is that we're seeing on the apprehension and flow side at the southwest border. So it's just a very important additional indicator to be watching in order to see what is temporary, what may be more permanent, and whether, as you say, there is a degree of just delayed decision-making going on here. That's actually my hypothesis, a wait and see, because things are so uncertain at this point. But as I say, this is, I think, important information to continue to watch. I think the second point that I'd like to raise for discussion does have to do with Mexico and Mexico's role in this whole phenomenon since 2014, when we hit the peak, which still is the peak, of this migration from the Northern Triangle countries. But, you know, in this country, so much of the discussion, it just is limited to what's happening at our own southwest border. And yet, those of us who have been working on this issue for a long time have tried to understand more fully what the changes are and what's really taking place have argued all along that you can only understand this if you're looking at the numbers that are manifest both in the U.S. data and in the Mexican data. And to make any real draw any inferences and conclusions from what may or may not be changing in Central America, one has to see that in relation to both Mexico and the United States. And that discussion takes then a couple of turns. One of the turns that it takes is, oh, well, the United States has just pressured Mexico into engaging in this issue. This is outsourcing from the United States a problem and a response to a problem, and the Mexicans are going to treat these people more harshly under any circumstances. So for the United States, this allows the U.S. to somewhat turn a blind eye. That debate is there and will continue. And however, the other side to that debate, I think, also needs some real understanding and discussion, and that is what Mexico's interests may or may not be in enforcement and in the heightened enforcement that we've seen over the last several years, even with, if you're correct, perhaps less level of effort taking place over time. Because Mexico is now in the very unique position, I think, around the world of being still somewhat ascending country, although that is definitely dramatically on the decrease. Also a transit country, which is what we see with the Central American migration, but increasingly a receiving country because it's a real problem for Mexico to have these numbers of people, not only from the neighboring region, Central America, crossing its territory, but as some of your that other slide of yours shows, a transit country for nationals of other more faraway nations. So from a policy standpoint and in terms of cooperation and the overall relationships within the region, the Mexico picture here is a very important part of it, and your data points a little bit to ways to talk about that more fully as well. I think the next point that I would make has to do with the multi-causality that you point to of this migration. And the first numbers are a little bit surprising. I think it was 17%, maybe it was 21% of noting family connection as the reason for leaving. We, of course, from the United States standpoint, as young people come and all of the issues of release and placement and family members and school admission, et cetera, have perceived this, and the data show this as heavily family-based or relatives in the United States based migration. But I think that is probably explained then in your data, in your research by the data later, that actually about 71% of people have some kind of a family connection in the United States. That's much more consistent with what it is that we've seen, but it does really point to this idea that you stress so heavily of the multi-causality where the reasons for the migration are concerned. It also points to the difficulty for U.S. institutions of actually making decisions about the future of these migrants, because this migration, of course, has brought into full view our political asylum decision-making system, the role of humanitarian decisions and protection traditions that have been built into the U.S. tradition, and the extreme difficulty with a population like this of making those decisions. What are the predominant factors? And that's, of course, been a point of real stress and real pressure on systems in the United States that are not adequately funded to and haven't been as effectively administered, I would argue, to respond to this population. But it is also an indication of what we term in immigration discussions as mixed flows and the difficulty of mixed flows. And that is very much the new challenge for the United States with Southwest border enforcement, as well as with the changing nature of migration within the hemisphere. And we've by no means solved that, and these data really point to how complicated it is and will continue to be to solve that. I think another point in your research that doesn't get much discussion that I think is very important is the internal displacement point. And although I can't tell you that I could really read those maps that you, I couldn't, the littler green dots from the larger green dots, the darker red from the lighter red, if nothing else, it demonstrates how very across the board and complicated this is in the countries themselves. But the fact that there is as much internal displacement taking place in these countries as those mappings show is also, it seems to me, another really important data point on how unsettled and how troubled circumstances are for people individually in their homes and in their home communities, that there would be this much movement, because that is typically the first response. Typically, the first response is to go to wherever the nearest safe place is. And that is not appreciated in the United States. It's not appreciated in the U.S. dialogue. It is very much part of what we understand to be refugee-related circumstances in countries around the world. But this points to the fact that that is certainly also happening in Central America. However, I also do wonder, I'm sure there's no way to know this, but I do wonder whether there is any connection between that and the family data, the high levels of family connection in migrants, and whether it is the case, perhaps, that those people who move internally are more likely to be people that don't have any connection outside of the country, and those people who do have a family member or somebody that they know or some community connection in the United States are far more likely to more readily attempt cross-national migration as compared with going to a nearby place where there might be some safety. And those are important dynamics to understand from the standpoint of solutions and responses that actually can make a difference, so that there are more nuanced responses rather than a one-size-fits-all, which tends to be what's taking place in our policies at the present time. Finally, then, I would like to say, I was struck by a couple of things that you talked about where reintegration is concerned and IOM's work is concerned. Because when you look at the research, in addition to some of the other materials that at least I received, and maybe they were out there for others, about IOM itself and IOM's activities in the region, it raises a couple of interesting points for me. And one is the relationship between what AID is funding through IOM and others, I take it, on reintegration in the region, and what is the Alliance for Prosperity, because the Alliance for Prosperity has been a very important policy initiative on the part of the United States. We don't know how much it's going to continue, but it was definitely an effort from the get-go to recognize that there are deeper issues here that have to be tackled through development and better conditions in source countries. Those are longer-term initiatives, we know, but the last administration did really commit itself to pressing very hard, and the Congress surprisingly agreed and allocated important amounts of, or significant amounts of money for it. But it's been very difficult to track what's, you know, as people not in the government, it's been very difficult to track where that money is, where it's going, for what purposes it's really going. And I'm wondering now, looking at these materials, whether that is the same as the AID funding, or whether the AID funding actually existed earlier and is perhaps having more of an impact. So again, for policy purposes and for better and more informed dialogue within the United States on these issues, I'd love to, you know more about all of that. But regardless of where the funding is coming from, I am impressed that the IOM materials are so specific, and your slides, Natalia, were really proved out the report card aspects of this. I mean, IOM's materials are very explicit on this many people, this many facilities, this many, you know, additional numbers of people that are able to be interviewed and seen. You can hardly get more results-oriented than that in what's happening with money. And we don't typically see that. We typically see more generic kinds of explanations of things. And this actually goes along with IOM's reputation overall, which has always been to be the pragmatic institution above all of all the international organizations, you know, that work in these fields. And so I'm pleased to see that, and it is important, results-oriented. I do think my own reaction to it is that a great deal of it does have to do with capacity and facilities. We probably don't know enough yet to know, but it will be really important over the long term to determine how that then does translate to the actual futures and the actual fate, you know, of the people that have gone through those processes. But it has to start somewhere, and those are very important places to start. So that's important. The other thing that I think is important about the reintegration is that it does finally, I think, say some things about these countries individually. You know, we always lump Central America together as Central America and the NTCA. But these are separate countries, small, yes, but they are separate with separate histories and in some ways distinct problems. Many of the problems are shared: governance, poverty, lack of opportunity, etc. But they do come about for slightly different reasons, and they do have differences in their civil society sectors, in the way that they're you know, what the populations are. Guatemala, which with its very distinct characteristics, as you pointed out, of so many different language groups and histories. And at the end of the day, improving conditions in Central America and Central America becoming viable as a region will depend on the countries themselves and the differences as well as the similarities within the countries being able to be addressed. And this does start to get at that in some ways that that we haven't typically seen. So those are all issues, it seems to me, that I found very interesting, that lend themselves to deeper dialogue and understanding. And so thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Doris. I appreciate your sharing your expertise and knowledge about these issues and your perspective. I want to protect the maximum amount of time for people in the audience to ask questions. But Jorge, if you had a quick comment, something glaring or a big hole or something, please do so.
Great. I will be very quick. First of all, I wanted to clarify an issue of terminology because there was one question regarding the word returnees and what it implies. David clarified, but it's a little bit complex because in fact, when we refer to the U.S. returnees, mostly we refer to deportees. There's no way that we catch the number of people who are returning voluntarily once they are asked to leave the country, the United States. In the case of Mexico, it's a little bit different because there are agreements between the Northern Triangle countries and Mexico, and they are called voluntary returns. So in strict sense, and considering that administratively they are not deported from Mexico, they are voluntary returns. So it's the figure is, and that's the reason why we prefer to refer as returnees in general, just to clarify that. I fully agree with, and I wanted to clarify also when my colleague David mentioned, and I saw my colleague from OEAS saying, yeah, the trends for the last 2 years, now that this 2017 is a little bit different from the previous 2 years, but the years before it was also different because also we had certain moments more people being returned from the United States. And I would like to link this to what Doris mentioned. We definitely Mexico plays a major role. The enforcement of the Frontera Sur program is a key issue, but we also have to acknowledge that there are more migration towards south. We see more migrants from the Northern Triangle countries going to Panama, Costa Rica, and therefore Belize has been also a place where a lot of migrants from El Salvador are arriving. So just to mention that very quickly. And regarding the presentation Natalia did, I would like to highlight the thing that one of the challenges we are facing right now is around the rhetorics that are being used. When people refer to prioritizing deportation of people involved with pandillas, gangs, maras, and when we try to counterfight the stigmatization of returnees, that's a big problem because even in the countries of origin, Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, people are now linking a lot, as it was in the past, that returnees are criminals, no? And therefore our efforts to have a proper reintegration process will be harder because the first part, and we've seen it, for example, in Guatemala, when we talk to the private sector, why it's important to offer job opportunities to people who are being returned, the first thing is to convince them that they are not criminals. So that's an interesting thing that we are challenging. And finally, well, I cannot answer your question regarding how this is linked to the AFP, the Alliance for Prosperity, and the work we are doing. I see the colleagues here from USA, maybe they would like to comment on that. But what I would say is, and I would like to use this opportunity to thank USA, but because all the work that we have done and that we have shown here has been done thanks to the U.S. cooperation, the USAID agency. We have had also the support in certain actions of the Department of State, PRM, and so on. But and I want to thank your comments regarding IOM's work, how it's known, and so on. So, but let's.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. I think what I'm going to do is take 3 questions. Raise your hands, wait for the microphone, keep them short so we can do more than one round. So I have one here, I have one in front, and I'll take one over here, and I promise to get to the rest of you as long as everybody cooperates and keeps it short.
It'll be
Go
short.
ahead. Thank you. Yes. Please tell us who you are.
Sure. Jane Bloom, International Catholic Migration Commission. My question is to David, but also Natalia, if you would weigh in as well, on the topic of recidivism. We understand from our missions that coyotes give a 3-for-1, you get 3 tries for 1 price. So people are coming, it's circular, they're coming back and trying again. So first of all, on the data, I'm questioning in terms of the, I didn't see anything specific to recidivism. And for Natalia, I wondered if this was Jose's third time, would the services be any different? Is anything tailored in terms of these repeated returning kids?
Good. We had a question right here in the front row. Arnold or whoever's here. Oh, Crystal. Go ahead.
Hi, Andres Villaveses from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I have a question for David in regards to the Venn diagram that you presented. If you could just expand a little bit more on how those percentages were assigned. Obviously, this is based on a survey data, but just to explain a little bit further how you came up with the percentages of multi-causality in the different parts of the diagram. Thanks.
Good. And then we had a question here with the gentleman in the red tie, and then I promise 1, 2, and 3 back there. So thank you. Oh, you want to look at it again, the Venn diagram?
It's easy.
Okay. All right. So recidivism.
Okay. So on the first question regarding the industry of migration, yes, there is anecdotal reference. We also included it in the survey to ask the families whether they had to use these services. But there is a limitation on the data that you will have a sample of the failures. So let's say the people who paid for a coyote and did not manage to establish themselves in their country of destination. So the percentages are lower than you would expect. Let me see if I can access from here. As for the anecdotal evidence, indeed, the industry is fairly sophisticated. There are menu of prices. We have basic prices starting from $6,000, $7,000 in El Salvador, reaching till $12,000, $13,000. What are the difference? The time it takes to get to your destination and the means of transport that you would use. Basically, you have a 3 trial guarantee deposit, and you can, if you are returned on the first time, you can attempt again. And we sometimes see, and Natalia and her team works really hard to try to block the taxi drivers. You don't know which ones are already waiting outside the reception centers. So people get in, particularly from Mexico, get in, get out of the reception center, right into the car, and back again to the border. So it is also very important because of 2 things. Number one, most people would have to have some sort of means of income and will have probably even mortgage their property to pay for these trips. Yes, a house can be that cheap in El Salvador in some regions. Or maybe they have like the land. They will mortgage that, and then when they come back, they lost it. So that's a big problem in development, quality of life, general well-being of the family, and so on. Well, if the 3rd trial is not successful, then you don't get your money back. Yeah. There is something that we see consistently in the 3 countries, but we have not. Maybe this year we're thinking about getting more into the coyote topic, but our main priority were the conditions and the conditions right now in which the children will live in. Definitely, there is a very strong industry. You can get there as far as in 3 days, 4 days, if you have enough money. And another thing is that considering income, we see a bell-shaped curve, meaning that as far as income it is. So if you are extremely, extremely poor, you cannot probably migrate. You have to be poor, but not that poor. So this is not much, and then this is income. And then when you reach a certain level of wealth, you're less likely to attempt to migrate irregularly as well.
Okay, well, that's a really good question indeed. Things have changed in the 3 countries in order to reduce recidivism. And for example, there's really good new strategies and program, like for example CANAF in El Salvador. This is a center of attention for children, adolescents, and families. And this is a new strategy led by the government institutions in charge of the protection of children in El Salvador. And it's linked to follow up the attention and the care process and protection of children returnees in El Salvador. And for example, this is already functioning in 5 departments of the country. And now when a children has arrived maybe for the second time in the reception center, these institutions have registered their profile and can keep track of this child once in country of origin. And it happens the same thing as well in Guatemala, and there's initiatives like, for example, Centros Quédate at local communities as well. Yes.
Well, one of the things is that there is current efforts to strengthen government information systems to be able to link it more accurately to ID registration. As you know, there are differences, maybe, well, most of you maybe don't know, but in El Salvador, registration for children differently from Honduras and Guatemala is done by birth certificate, which is emitted by the municipalities, not by a central institution. So, and the standards, even for the size of the code or the codes and the types of the codes, varies amongst municipalities. So we have a big challenge in trying to register that information for follow-up. Child protection institutions have to travel all the way to their communities of origin to try to find some person who will be able to be considered as an idoneous person to receive the child. You cannot, when the child arrives, it cannot be handled to any person, right? We could be handling them to the worst possible profiles. So government institutions in the 3 countries work really hard on that, but in El Salvador there is a challenge. Why am I talking about IDs? Because it allows you to be able to quantify the yes. And there's some data, basically from El Salvador. We've seen the numbers around 15%, but it might be a little bit underestimated. Probably this year numbers will be much better. As for the Venn diagram, okay, so I cannot show you here, but the numbers were a little bit different from the icons, right? Because we added up standards of living plus employment, and that would be a total. Then we have violence and insecurity, another total. And we had family reunification, another total. And then the Venn diagram makes it 100%. So numbers will go a little bit different. But the main objective of the chart is basically to see or to show that there is interaction in between all those variables.
Okay, we didn't get your question?
No, good morning. I'm Tim Lowell with
Good morning.
USAID.
Okay.
My question is for Natalia, and it's in reference to the role being played by faith-based, either Catholic or evangelical groups in these respective countries in assisting with the reintegration process. Thanks.
Okay, we'll take a question right next to you, and then right behind. No, the woman right next to him had a question.
Good morning, Alejandra Argueta from Freedom House. Thank you for the panelists for an excellent presentation. My question is there a differentiated reception and reintegration process or protocol for returnees that have spent a longer period of time outside the country and those that are almost immediate returns? Thank you.
Thank you. And then one final question here, and then we'll take another round.
Sonia Michelle, University of Maryland. Yeah, I was going to ask that question too. Do you have data on how long people have been outside of the country? Second, what is the impact when people return? Obviously, their remittances are not coming back. So how does that affect households? And then third, does the length of the time out of the country affect the ways that, for example, children reintegrate into households? Are they less likely to accept parental authority? They've been on their own, living on their own. Does that cause problems? And second, do women who've been experiencing a different set of gender relations and perhaps feel more independence having been outside the country, does that create problems reintegrating into their households?
Thank you. We'll try to take another round here in a second, but but let's let our experts enlighten us.
Well, definitely, they do play a key role, and they are actually providing assistance as well, coordinating in the 3 countries with national governments. As for example, the Scalarini have been working with providing post-arrival assistance in the 3 countries, specifically in the reception centers, but also now assistance during the reintegration, but most of all focused in adults and families as well. But they play a key part of it, yes, definitely. I don't know. Do you have anything about that? No? Okay. And then regarding the question of if there, I don't know if I understood well, but if there is a difference between the assistance provided by the post-arrival assistance, if there is a child that has been more time in abroad, was that? Yeah. Well, that is still a challenge, definitely, but it happens most of all in adults, with adults coming back from the US, yes. Because in terms of people coming back from Mexico, it hasn't been a much time that they've been abroad. So yes, it's still a challenge, but there are efforts already done, yeah.
There was a question about, oh, go ahead, David.
Just on the part of differentiation by the period they have lived abroad. Well, one factor I didn't mention, and it's really important, is that these surveys were done to unaccompanied migrant children's families returning. The children returning to the country, and the family is waiting for them. 99% of the returning migrant children are coming from Mexico. So it's just 1% from the U.S. And that's a very important topic.
The implication there is that they've not been out of the household for a long period of time.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
that's the implication.
Thank you, Rick. Yes.
Right,
Yes.
okay.
My point is that, the detention period is from 1 week to 2 week tops. So it's not so much that type of population as we see in returns from the U.S., in which you would find, in personal experience, a person who lived 20 years in the U.S. and was managing at Dunkin' Donuts in Boston. And yeah, that will be a serious challenge for reintegration, of course.
I just want to add to the question on remittances, because also these sort of profiles, considering that it's not the same if you're being returned from Mexico or the United States, the remittances also has a different cycle. It takes some time for you to start sending remittances. So we should be careful to link this issue of returnees directly to conclusions on remittances, because the cycles are different. Just to clarify, we finalized a research on remittances for Guatemala, and we're about to have it for El Salvador soon. And we have concrete details on these issues that you asked.
Yes, we have publications in the Guatemala National Household Survey on Remittances and Migration. You can access this in our website, and this year El Salvador, next year Honduras, hopefully.
There was a question here from the gentleman on faith-based organizations and the role they played. What do you want to?
That's what Natalia said. Scalarini and.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'm sorry.
But just to add up, there are some really important institutions working on the field, of course. Natalia mentioned one that is in the 3 countries, but basically it is absolutely important in Honduras, particularly for the reception of returning migrants who are adults coming via air.
Good. I want to get the woman here in the white sweater. Adam, did you want to add something about this discussion, or was it another question? Okay, so let's let Adam Schmidt from USAID make a clarification, then I will go there, the gentleman behind you, and I'll take one way in the back there, just to be fair.
Thanks,
Okay,
Eric.
Adam.
Schmidt, USAID El Salvador. Really happy that this conversation is taking place today. Just wanted to provide some clarification first on Alliance for Prosperity and USAID's interaction with the plan. That is a plan that was jointly created by the 3 Northern Triangle countries. Obviously, we have some distinguished representatives here today who may be able to speak more in detail about the plan. What USAID is doing is, on a regular basis, coordinating consultative forums, coordination of our development agendas with the agendas of the governments, host country governments. When we look at the issues, prosperity, security, institutional strengthening, these very much align with the overall theme of migration. Better, more prosperous communities that would not have pull factors, push factors, or there are solutions within the host country communities. To look very much at the data, I just wanted to add a point because we've worked very closely with this IOM team. You've got an exceptional group here today to essentially say anecdotes cannot drive this discussion. 2 years ago, that's what this was about. It's violence, it's family unification, it's it's multi-causal. I think David has said that very well. But there's evidence. There's data that can connect back to what, in fact, is pushing this, what's pulling this. But with the data, what can we do? And I think the very important questions about recidivism, how do you break the chain of repeat migration? And I think that's fundamental. How do you look to target development strategies working closely with government of El Salvador, government of Guatemala, government of Honduras, to ensure that your interventions are meeting the needs of that community dimension. Really a big compliment here from my perspective, working daily with the government of El Salvador, to a degree with Honduras and Guatemala, really passionate, committed individuals and professionals who care deeply about this issue and frankly are providing leadership, particularly in the areas of reintegration and reinsertion. On the return and repatriation, I think Natalia has explained it very well. The dignified return, the commitment, the multi-institutional effort is very, very impressive, and I think it will stand as a standard for other parts of the world to consider and to learn from. So I just wanted to add that clarification. And finally, Eric, thanks to the Wilson Center for this opportunity today.
Of course, thank you. You've been very patient, so thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Emily Kephart with the Child Migrant Return and Reintegration Project at KIND, Kids in Need of Defense. Just two things. First of all, I have been to and seen and worked with some of the staff at the Guatemalan reception centers, and I congratulate you all on some of the very large strides and the capacity building that's been happening there over the last several years. It is a vast improvement. And so my first question is, what are the plans for the next step? I mean, we've talked very much about the return and reception processes, but what plans does IOM have, if any, to look at the longer term actual reintegration services that happen in children's communities when they get back to living with their parents? I coordinate a very small project that works on the providing those kinds of services. And we see the value in also being able to monitor the changing dynamics. What happens, what does this child and their circumstance look like a month after or 3 months after their return, and how does that affect their decisions to stay in their communities or to remigrate, et cetera. And then the second question is, Natalia, I think you mentioned increasing mechanisms to share information and data collection between government entities, and I'm wondering if there's any plans to sort of approach US-based entities. The Office of Refugee Resettlement does a lot of work with the children that they are the caretakers of while they're here before they return to their countries, and there's currently no real mechanism to transfer that information if they've had psychological evaluations, if they've had medical care, especially for some of the children who've been here for a long time, who've had significant needs, how to transfer that information.
Okay,
Eric.
thank you very much. The gentleman behind you, if you wouldn't mind being brief, we can get some more answers in here.
Yes, my name is Daniel Diaz from Citizenship and Immigration Services. And my question is about the adults that are returning back to the reception centers. If there's anything that is being done to coordinate or provide guidance, maybe to protect or reduce gang extortion or gang violence against the people that is returning home.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, and there was one last one in the back, and I apologize that we didn't get all of them in, but go ahead. I'm sorry I can't even see who it is. It's probably probably my wife or something. No, I don't think so. Is that Mary?
This is Mary Speck.
Oh, okay,
Yes,
Mary.
I
No,
lived
we're not married.
I lived in the region a number of years for Crisis Group. I'm now working independently here in Washington. I was also interested in the long term, or how long reintegration services can be provided after. I imagine that varies widely by country, but I wonder if you can give us an idea. My other question is, the emphasis seems to be on reintegration into the community of origin. But given the high rates of internal displacement, is this really the best way to prevent recidivism? You're sending them back to the same conditions they faced, even if they get a few more services. I would assume that in many cases, this does not substantially change the conditions, both of violence and lack of opportunity, and perhaps domestic abuse that they faced originally. So is there any thought, this gets more complicated, but I wonder if USAID also, they might comment on, is working on create reintegration to other communities so that they don't go back to the same situation.
Great, terrific, Mary, thank you. Let's try to wrap this up, but these are all really good questions. So should I start with David or Natalie? You're frantically writing notes, so why don't you go ahead?
Thank you so much. So what are the plans for the longer term in terms of reintegration? Well, one of them is to keep supporting national plans and to strengthen the national capacities. And there are several plans that the three governments already have, like, for example, Plan El Salvador Seguro in El Salvador, and linked with the effort that they are doing right now at the municipality level. And when we talk about reintegration, we tend to only think about working with the authorities at the national level, and this is not the only way. We have to work also with the communities, with the people that have stayed in the countries, and to work with them on how to receive the migrant, but also how to incorporate all of them into society again, and try not to make much difference between one and another, you know. So there are a lot of activities that we have in mind, and we already started to work in the three countries. I cannot tell you all of each one of them, but we are working, for example, already in Guatemala with Centros Quédate as well, reinforcing the capacities for employment and making life plans for adolescents and migrant returnees. And each country, as someone said before, has their own particular conditions. So we cannot say that it's the same thing for the three of them, but yet they have already plans that we will support in the long term. And when we talk about how long, it's difficult to calculate. We cannot say this is a thing that we can change in one day or until next year or something. Yes.
I'm going to answer the questions regarding also the issue of internal displacement and so on, because that's an area where we're coordinating with UNHCR and other international organizations. And also in discussion, for example, in the case of Honduras, there is a plan also to they are drafting an action plan, strategy plan on how to provide answers to this issue. As you said, it's complex. We have to check again, and when we refer to the multifactorial causes of migration, since they are quite linked with the economic situation and so on, we definitely, and that's the good thing with when we check the Alliance for Prosperity plan, because many of the issues we have to go back to structural changes that are related to the wealth of the economy and opportunities, job opportunities where people are and so on. So it's a little bit complex, and I would like to link also the programs that the countries are putting in place for people who are being returned cannot also ignore the reality of the rest of the people who also need some sort of support. And for example, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Honduras, we have been discussing this issue because they are afraid that the programs that they are developing will, in a way, cause a sort of dependence, and why are these people who are being returned have a special treatment than the rest of the population? So it's indeed complex. Strategies are being defined from the perspective of the different governments, but yeah, I just wanted to add on this.
David, do you have something briefly? Doris, do you have any final parting comments? I'll give you a chance. Go ahead.
Just to go to the previous question, I got the percentages from Coyote, but keep in mind that it's the people who did not reach the destination. But for El Salvador, it's 62% used the services of Coyote. The returning migrants, meaning the people who did not make it. So you cannot generalize it to all the children are traveling. But 62% of all the children who are traveling or migrating used the services of a Coyote, but this is the people who return. Probably is much higher. The success rate is probably much higher for Coyote users. Guatemala, 39%, and Honduras, 40%. Another important thing was that 30% of children in Guatemala were actually migrating to Mexico for work. But all the same, return. And the other thing is, yes, as Chief said, there is an important effort from the governments in terms of specific programs, like in El Salvador, Unidad de Atención a Víctimas, and in Honduras there is also una mesa, an organization, both national and governmental and non-governmental organizations, to deal with these cases of people who are returning or being internally displaced and cannot go back to the original places. However, it's something that has started relatively recently, so unfortunately most people would have to see in their own means to go somewhere else. Yeah.
Okay. I had one comment and question. I'm kind of deeply alarmed here also by this point that Jorge made earlier about the rhetoric that seeks to sort of portray returnees as criminals. And it's one thing, what has impact here, but how it impacts people back in Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala is also worrisome, One of the perennial complaints, legitimate complaints on the part of the governments of Northern Triangle, is they didn't have enough information, enough warning. Who are these people coming back? Are they really hardened, violent criminals, or are they criminals of a different sort? And I do think that's a really troublesome and worrisome thing. And I just, very quickly, is it your sense the governments now get adequate information? I might even ask Ambassador Kanghura to comment. Are you getting adequate information about the types of people coming back, the amounts of people, all these sorts of things that would help be able to receive and reintegrate more? What anything you can say briefly, and I know I'm taking time. Go ahead.
Well, we have been discussing with DHS the possibility of showing some of the figures, because when we read the percentage of criminalities and different types and so on, that information will help people to better understand what the real situation is and the profiles of these people who are returning back to their countries. Also the actions taken and this. So information, we have to strengthen as the capacities still, because information is vital also for the reintegration processes. We have been discussing that if, for example, the consular authorities here in the United States and Mexico already gather certain vital information that will help in the reintegration process or assistance, that will help a lot and improve a lot the processes to support them. But in terms of stigmatization, we definitely, I think it's in the case of the figures that we have for El Salvador in 2015, it was less than 10% people who have real criminal file, and this sort of information has to be publicly known to reduce the stigma.
Okay.
I just wanted to add, Eric, that information, as Jorge was saying, is not only important for us as IOM or for you that are in the public, but also to be exchanged among the different national institutions and other agencies, and agencies not only in the government, based in the government, in at national levels, in countries of origin, but also abroad. And it's already been happening. And this information is key to better address the actions that we are already implementing and link them with other plans that are necessary and are already on march.
Okay, let me make a very quick announcement. On June 8th, we haven't sent out the announcement yet, but on June 8th, we'll have an event that we're partnering with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. They have a series of studies about the humanitarian crisis in Central America, in the Northern Triangle, and they will be presenting those reports. You're pointing at somebody. Huh? Oh, okay. Let me just finish, and then I'm sorry, yes. So June 8th, probably at the same general hour as we always do. Keep an eye open for that. Let me, before I turn to the ambassador, just thank our team, our AV team, for all their efforts. Anders Bill really helped organize this event. Our interns, Crystal Rodriguez and Arnold, thank you. Arthur, I'm sorry. Thank you all for your role. And Madam Ambassador, you have the final word.
Thank you. So I think I can intervene in all the issues that we talk about. But I just want to point on some things. Just for the last question, I just would like to say that the people, the returnees that comes to our country that have criminal file are just the less. All that are people that return to our country are just persons that have been working here for so many years, that have been engaged with their families, that have been working integrated in the communities here in the United States, sending remittance to our country. There are people that are known, are in the worldwide known, the Salvadorian people and the Central American people. We are people that are known in all over the world for being good workers. So that's our people. I want to say that the stigmatization is just a challenge for us, and we have to work on explaining and talking every day and in every chance that we have to explain the world that we are not bad people. And we understand that we have the challenge with the persons we have a criminals files. We understand and we accept that, and we offer our commitment, and all our institutions are working together. We are not working alone like islands. We have a committee, just an instrument in our country that work with all the institutions together. After that, we exchange the information with the authorities of the United States. We are working together in that. We understand that we can make it alone. So the way that we exchange the information is fundamental for us. Okay, so in the plan for the Alliance, I would like to take advantage of this opportunity.
Briefly.
And maybe I can ask you to invite the ambassador from Guatemala, from Honduras, and me, and we will delighted with you to be here to talk about it, okay?
Exactly.
Thank you
Glad
so
to do it. Thank you. Join me in thanking the ambassador, our panelists, Doris Meisner. Thank you all very much. Hope to see you on June the 8th. We're going to do a...
Likewise. We haven't met before, have we? Have we met before? I don't think so. Sometimes I don't.
But I've read a lot of your